The court of Henry VIII operated within a political culture where accusations of treason were not merely legal matters, but instruments embedded within the machinery of royal authority. Historical records indicate that the Tudor state had expanded its legal definitions of treason during this period, particularly through statutes such as the Treason Act of 1534, which extended culpability beyond overt rebellion to include words, intentions, and, crucially, perceived threats to the succession. Within this framework, Queen's consort occupied a uniquely precarious position. Their proximity to the king granted them influence, yet it also exposed them to scrutiny shaped by factional rivalry, religious transformation, and the anxieties of dynastic continuity. Contemporary accounts describe the Tudor court as an environment governed by surveillance and patronage networks. Courtiers advanced their interests by aligning with powerful figures, and queens often became focal points around which these alliances formed. Surviving documents suggest that accusations against queens were rarely isolated incidents. Rather, they emerged from broader political tensions. The downfall of a queen could signal a shift in policy, religious direction, or factional dominance. The case of Anne Boleyn illustrates how treason accusations functioned within this system. Chroniclers noted that Anne's position had become increasingly unstable by 1536. She had failed to produce a surviving male heir, and her influence over the king's religious policies had created powerful enemies among both conservative and reformist factions. Legal records reveal that the charges brought against her included adultery, incest, and conspiracy to kill the king, offenses that, under Tudor law, constituted high treason. Surviving trial documents suggest that the evidentiary basis for these charges was weak by modern standards. Testimonies were often extracted under pressure, and the legal proceedings moved with notable speed. The structure of Tudor justice, particularly in cases involving the monarchy, allowed for limited defense. Accused individuals were not entitled to legal counsel in the modern sense, and the outcome of such trials often reflected political imperatives rather than impartial adjudication. In Anne Boleyn's case, the rapid sequence from accusation to execution indicates a process driven by urgency, possibly reflecting the king's shifting priorities and the court's readiness to accommodate them. The lived reality for a queen accused of treason involved immediate isolation. Records from the Tower of London describe the conditions under which high-status prisoners were held. While queens were afforded certain privileges, such as private chambers and attendance, their confinement was nonetheless absolute. Communication with allies was restricted, and access to information was controlled. This isolation served both practical and symbolic purposes. It prevented coordination of resistance and reinforced the authority of the crown by demonstrating that even the highest-ranking individuals could be rendered powerless. Chroniclers noted that the psychological dimension of this confinement was significant. Queens who had previously exercised influence within the court found themselves dependent on the same structures that had once elevated them. The shift from authority to vulnerability was abrupt, and surviving letters suggest a heightened awareness of the precariousness of royal favor. The absence of transparent legal recourse meant that accused queens had limited means to challenge the charges against them. The mechanisms of control extended beyond imprisonment. Interrogations, often conducted by members of the King's Council, sought to establish narratives that aligned with the charges. While there is limited direct evidence of physical coercion in the cases of queens, the broader context of Tudor justice indicates that witnesses and alleged accomplices were subjected to varying degrees of pressure. Statements obtained under such conditions contributed to the construction of cases that, once formalized, were difficult to contest. The trial process itself was shaped by ceremonial and hierarchical considerations. Queens were typically tried by a panel of peers, reflecting their status within the aristocracy. However, historical records indicate that these proceedings were influenced by the expectations of royal authority. The presence of high-ranking nobles did not necessarily guarantee impartiality. Rather, it underscored the collective participation of the elite in upholding the decisions of the crown. The outcome of such trials often reinforced the existing power structure, demonstrating the alignment of the nobility with the king's will. The execution of a queen accused of treason carried both legal and symbolic significance. In Anne Boleyn's case, chroniclers recorded that a foreign executioner was brought in, possibly to ensure efficiency and to maintain a degree of decorum. The method of execution, beheading by sword, was considered more precise than the traditional axe. This detail reflects the intersection of punishment and presentation within Tudor political culture. The execution was not only a legal consequence, but also a public statement about the enforcement of royal authority. A similar pattern can be observed in the case of Catherine Howard, whose downfall occurred in 1541. Surviving documents suggest that the charges against her centered on allegations of sexual misconduct prior to and during her marriage to the king. Under the expanded definitions of treason, such behavior was interpreted as a threat to the legitimacy of the royal lineage. The legal codes of the period reveal that the queen's body was effectively politicized. Her actions were not assessed solely in moral terms, but in relation to their implications for succession. Contemporary accounts describe the investigation into Catherine Howard's conduct as thorough and methodical. Members of the council gathered testimonies from individuals connected to her past, constructing a narrative that supported the charges. The process reflects the administrative capacity of the Tudor state, which had developed mechanisms for collecting and evaluating information in politically sensitive cases. However, the same records indicate that the outcome was largely predetermined once the king's confidence had been lost. The consequences for queens accused of treason extended beyond their own fate. Their families, allies, and servants often faced repercussions, ranging from loss of status to imprisonment or execution. This broader impact reinforced the deterrent effect of treason prosecutions. It signaled that loyalty to the crown was expected not only from individuals, but from entire networks. The dismantling of these networks served to consolidate royal authority and to discourage dissent. Long-term effects of these events can be observed in the evolving relationship between the monarchy and the aristocracy. The repeated use of treason charges against high-ranking individuals, including queens, contributed to a climate of caution within the court. Surviving correspondence from the period suggests that courtiers became increasingly aware of the risks associated with proximity to power. This awareness influenced behavior, encouraging displays of loyalty and discouraging actions that might be interpreted as disloyal. The experiences of queens accused of treason in the court of Henry VIII reveal a system in which legal processes were closely intertwined with political objectives. Historical records indicate that the boundaries between justice and expediency were often blurred. The mechanisms of control, surveillance, isolation, interrogation, and public punishment functioned together to maintain the authority of the crown. Within this system, queens were both symbols of dynastic continuity and participants in a political environment that could, under certain conditions, turn decisively against them. Surviving documents suggest that these cases were not anomalies, but integral to the operation of Tudor governance. The use of treason accusations against queens underscores the extent to which personal relationships within the royal household were subject to political calculation. The consequences of these accusations, both immediate and long-term, reflect the broader dynamics of power in early modern England, where authority was asserted not only through governance, but through the visible enforcement of loyalty at the highest levels of society. The legal and political treatment of queens accused of treason did not end with conviction or execution. Surviving documents suggest that the process extended into the management of memory, reputation, and historical record. In the aftermath of a queen's downfall, official narratives were often reinforced through proclamations and chronicled accounts that justified the actions of the crown. These narratives emphasized the gravity of the alleged offenses, framing them as existential threats to the stability of the realm. In doing so, the Tudor state not only punished the individual, but also sought to control how the event would be understood by contemporaries and future generations. Chroniclers noted that the language used in official records frequently portrayed accused queens as having violated both legal and moral codes. This dual framing served a strategic purpose. By aligning accusations of treason with broader concerns about morality and order, the crown reinforced its authority as both a political and moral arbiter. Historical records indicate that this approach was particularly effective in a period marked by religious transformation, where questions of orthodoxy and loyalty were closely intertwined. The case of Catherine of Aragon, while distinct in its legal outcome, provides additional insight into how the Tudor court managed challenges to royal authority involving queens. Although she was not formally accused of treason, her refusal to accept the annulment of her marriage to Henry VIII created a prolonged political and legal conflict. Surviving correspondence suggests that her steadfast position was perceived as a challenge to the king's supremacy, particularly after the establishment of the monarch as head of the Church of England. The legal codes of the period reveal that such resistance, while not prosecuted as treason in her case, occupied a similar conceptual space in terms of its perceived threat to royal authority. Contemporary accounts describe how Catherine of Aragon was gradually isolated from the court and stripped of her status. She was no longer recognized as queen but referred to as the Dowager Princess of Wales. This redefinition of her identity reflects a broader mechanism of control within the Tudor system. By altering titles and official designations, the crown could reshape the political reality surrounding an individual. The process underscores the extent to which authority in this period was mediated through formal recognition and institutional language. Surviving documents suggest that queens who fell from favor were subject to a systematic erasure of their influence. Their households were dismantled, their allies reassigned or dismissed, and their access to communication severely restricted. This administrative response functioned as a means of consolidating power while minimizing the risk of opposition. In the absence of direct rebellion, control over information and association proved to be an effective strategy for neutralizing potential threats. The experience of Jane Seymour, though not associated with treason, provides a contrasting perspective that highlights the conditional nature of security within the Tudor court. Her position remained stable largely due to her successful delivery of a male heir, the future Edward VI. Historical records indicate that this achievement significantly strengthened her standing and reduced the likelihood of accusations. The comparison underscores the centrality of succession in determining the fortunes of queens. Those who fulfilled this expectation were afforded a degree of protection, while those who did not remained vulnerable to shifting political dynamics. Chroniclers noted that the expansion of treason laws during Henry VIII's reign created a legal environment in which the boundaries of acceptable behavior were increasingly ambiguous. The Treason Act of 1534, along with subsequent legislation, allowed for the prosecution of individuals based on perceived intent or spoken words. For queens, whose actions were closely scrutinized, this ambiguity heightened the risk of accusation. Surviving legal texts suggest that the interpretation of treason was often influenced by the priorities of the crown, rather than by consistent legal principles. The role of the King's Council in these processes was significant. Composed of trusted advisors and officials, the council functioned as both an administrative body and a mechanism for implementing royal policy. Historical records indicate that council members were involved in the investigation, interrogation, and prosecution of accused queens. Their actions reflected a combination of loyalty to the crown and alignment with prevailing political currents. The council's involvement ensured that accusations of treason were integrated into the broader framework of governance, rather than treated as isolated incidents. The management of public perception was another critical aspect of these cases. While executions were often public events, the dissemination of information was carefully controlled. Proclamations and official statements provided a sanctioned interpretation of events, while alternative accounts were limited by the constraints of censorship and social hierarchy. Contemporary observers, including foreign ambassadors, recorded their impressions of these events, offering additional perspectives on how they were perceived both within and beyond England. These accounts suggest that the treatment of queens accused of treason attracted considerable attention, reflecting the broader implications for international relations and dynastic legitimacy. The intersection of gender and power is evident in the way accusations against queens were framed and prosecuted. Legal codes of the period reveal that expectations of female behavior played a role in shaping these cases. Allegations of sexual misconduct, for example, were particularly significant because of their implications for the legitimacy of heirs. Historical records indicate that such allegations were not only legal charges, but also tools for undermining the authority and credibility of the accused. The emphasis on chastity and fidelity reflects the broader societal norms that governed the role of queens within the Tudor system. Surviving documents suggest that the consequences of treason accusations extended into the cultural sphere. Ballads, pamphlets, and other forms of popular expression contributed to the dissemination of official narratives, while also reflecting public interest in these events. Although these sources must be approached with caution, they provide insight into how the downfall of queens was interpreted and understood by different segments of society. The persistence of these narratives indicates that the impact of such cases went beyond immediate political considerations, shaping collective memory and historical discourse. The administrative capacity of the Tudor state played a crucial role in enabling these processes. The development of record-keeping systems, legal frameworks, and bureaucratic structures allowed for the efficient management of complex cases involving high-ranking individuals. Historical records indicate that this capacity was both a product of and a contributor to the consolidation of royal authority. By institutionalizing mechanisms of control, the state could respond to perceived threats in a coordinated and systematic manner. The experiences of queens accused of treason also reveal the limitations of power within the Tudor court. While queens held significant influence, their position was ultimately dependent on the favor of the king and the stability of the political environment. Surviving correspondence suggests that even minor shifts in these factors could have profound consequences. The absence of independent power bases meant that queens were particularly vulnerable to changes in royal priorities and court dynamics. The broader implications of these cases can be observed in the evolution of political culture during Henry VIII's reign. The use of treason accusations as a tool of governance contributed to a climate in which loyalty was closely monitored and dissent was swiftly addressed. This approach reinforced the centralization of authority while also creating an environment of uncertainty and caution. Historical records indicate that this dynamic persisted beyond Henry VIII's reign, influencing the practices and perceptions of subsequent monarchs and their courts. The treatment of queens accused of treason thus reflects a convergence of legal, political, and cultural factors. Surviving documents suggest that these cases were shaped by the interplay of personal relationships, institutional structures, and broader societal norms. The outcomes, while often severe, were consistent with a system that prioritized the preservation of royal authority above all else. Within this system, the position of a queen was both elevated and precarious, defined by a balance of influence and vulnerability that could, under certain conditions, be decisively overturned. The consolidation of authority under Henry VIII increasingly relied on the integration of legal innovation, administrative discipline, and factional intelligence networks that operated within and around the royal court. Historical records indicate that the management of high-status treason cases, particularly those involving queens, was not solely a judicial matter, but a coordinated political operation. The rise of figures such as Thomas Cromwell illustrates how the machinery of government became more deeply involved in constructing, processing, and legitimizing accusations that reshaped the upper tiers of the monarchy itself. Surviving documents suggest that Cromwell and other senior advisors played a central role in gathering testimony, organizing interrogations, and interpreting evidence in ways that aligned with the strategic objectives of the crown. This was not unique to any single case, but reflected a broader institutional pattern. The council functioned as an intermediary between the king's personal authority and the formal mechanisms of law. In cases involving queens, this intermediary role became especially significant, as it allowed political considerations to be translated into legal outcomes without requiring direct public justification from the monarch. The use of parliamentary instruments, such as acts of attainder, became a particularly powerful tool in this context. Historical records indicate that attainders allowed the crown to declare individuals guilty of treason without the need for a full judicial trial. For queens accused of treason, this mechanism provided a means of bypassing procedural uncertainty while ensuring a definitive legal conclusion. Contemporary accounts describe how these acts were presented to Parliament as necessary measures for the protection of the realm, reinforcing the idea that loyalty to the crown was inseparable from the stability of the state itself. Legal codes of the period reveal that the expansion of treason law under Henry VIII created a framework in which intent and association could be treated as evidence of guilt. This shift had profound implications for queens, whose lives were embedded within dense networks of courtly interaction. Communication with courtiers, attendance at events, and even patterns of favor could be reinterpreted as indicators of political alignment. The ambiguity inherent in these interpretations allowed accusations to be constructed with considerable flexibility, while still maintaining a formal appearance of legal legitimacy. Chroniclers noted that the procedural aspects of these cases were often characterized by speed and coordination. Once an accusation gained traction within the council, investigative processes were rapidly initiated. Witnesses were summoned, correspondence was reviewed, and narratives were assembled to support the charges. Surviving records suggest that this process was less about discovering an objective truth and more about consolidating a coherent case that aligned with predetermined conclusions. The structure of Tudor governance enabled this alignment by concentrating decision-making authority within a relatively small group of trusted advisors. The physical and symbolic role of confinement remained central throughout these proceedings. The Tower of London continued to function as the primary site for the detention of high-status prisoners, including queens awaiting trial or execution. Historical accounts describe the Tower not merely as a place of imprisonment, but as a controlled environment in which political transitions were managed. Within its walls, the transformation of a queen from sovereign consort to accused traitor was formalized through ritualized processes of custody, interrogation, and isolation. Surviving correspondence indicates that access to imprisoned queens was tightly regulated. Attendants were carefully selected, and communication with the outside world was restricted to approved channels. This isolation served to prevent the formation of alternative narratives or coordinated resistance. At the same time, it reinforced the authority of the crown by demonstrating the reach of royal power into even the most elevated ranks of society. The containment of a queen within such a space carried a broader symbolic message about the limits of status when confronted with sovereign authority. The legal resolution of treason cases involving queens often culminated in executions that were carefully managed in both procedural and representational terms. Historical records indicate that the choice of execution method, timing, and setting was influenced by considerations of order and perception. While the act itself was punitive, it also functioned as a reaffirmation of legal hierarchy. The removal of a queen through judicial execution underscored the principle that no individual, regardless of rank, stood above the law as defined by the crown. Contemporary accounts describe how these events were communicated to the public through official proclamations. These statements frame the executions as necessary acts to preserve the security of the realm. At the same time, alternative interpretations circulated through informal networks, including diplomatic correspondence and oral transmission. Foreign observers often recorded these discrepancies, noting the tension between official narratives and external perceptions. This divergence highlights the complexity of information control in Tudor England, where authority was asserted not only through action, but through the management of interpretation.